Hi, everyone. I'm Raj Kumar, President and Editor-in-Chief of Devex, back again with this series of leader interviews we've been doing, and really with a leader who's right at the front lines of this, and that is the UN's humanitarian chief, Mark Lowcock, known to our community very well. Mark, thank you for taking some time in the midst of this crisis to speak with us.
Good to be with you, Raj. Thanks for all you're doing.
Thank you. And we're speaking at an opportune moment because on March 25th, the Secretary General put forward this global humanitarian response plan. And we are talking just before it is going to be publicly released, a new update to that plan. The original plan was a $2 billion appeal. What's new in the updated version?
Well, obviously 6 weeks have passed and we've observed two things. Firstly, that the virus continues to spread. It's effectively in every country on the planet now. It hasn't spread as fast as some people forecast. But it is increasing in the most vulnerable countries. Why hasn't it spread as fast? Well, maybe that's to do with the restrictive measures that lots of countries have put in place. Maybe we're not seeing the whole thing because there's very limited testing in many countries. Right. But maybe one thing we don't know is whether the virus behaves differently in different circumstances among different demographic groups, for example. We need to answer some of those questions. The second thing we've seen, and is much, much clearer, is a growing economic calamity with a huge contraction in the economies of the world's most vulnerable countries, a shooting up of the poverty rate for the first time actually in 30 years, really. Year on year, it's an amazing human story. For the last 30 years, the proportion of the global population in poverty has been falling. It's not going to fall this year, and that's because of COVID. And there's a big increase in very, very hungry people. We are forecasting, the Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Food Programme in the UN, forecasting potentially a doubling of people who will starve, will lose their lives if they don't get help, from 130 million people to 250 million people. Now, because of all that, the update to the appeal that we're issuing right now, as you say, is calling for $6.7 billion for 64 countries. There is a big increment in what we need to deal with the health dimension of the crisis and water and sanitation, but also big increase to handle all these food insecurity problems I've just talked about.
And should we be looking at this as incremental money, an incremental raise above all of the other official foreign assistance and humanitarian pledges that are out there already? How should we understand this figure?
Well, firstly, last time we asked for 2 billion, we got a bit more than $1 billion. So the new total is 6.7 or 5.7 in new money, if you like. That's just for our bit of the appeal. But I think the big picture question you ask is a really crucial question. Our assessment is that in order to protect the 10% of the world's most vulnerable people, those 700 million people, probably there needs to be a $90 billion package. So $90 billion is a lot of money, but it's equivalent to only 1% of the global stimulus package that the rich countries put in place to protect the world economy. And that money can be financed basically from two sources. 2/3 of it can come from the financial firepower that the international financial institutions, the World Bank and IMF, have. They'll need to change the terms that they can provide that money to the poorest countries, and they'll need some help to do that. For 60 billion, you could largely provide social protection, food and basic security for most of those people. And then the other 1/3 needs mostly to be in humanitarian assistance in those places where governments can't or won't provide social protection. And our 6.7 billion now is part of that 30 billion, if you like. We will be updating the response plan, which covers the work of the UN and all the brilliant NGOs around the world who we work with, regularly. The next update will be the end of June, and I think that the virus will be having a bigger impact by then, and we'll have to see what the economic impacts are. So it would be surprising to me if we're not looking for an increment above the new 6.7.
Let's talk about that. Given your perch as the UN humanitarian chief, you're looking across all of these many countries and the most vulnerable people in the world. It sounds like from your last comment, you're expecting we have not yet seen the worst in terms of the pandemic itself, the viral spread. What do you anticipate is likely to happen?
Well, we don't know because there's so many uncertainties, but our best guess based on the modeling the World Health Organization has done and other modeling that other people have done is the maximum impact of at least this first phase of the disease is going to be somewhere between 3 and 6 months from now in many countries. Of course, there's also talk in North America and Europe about a possible second wave come the fall or winter. But for that first phase, in terms of the disease, our best guess is between 3 and 6 months from now, a lot of countries will find their peak. The economic dimension probably will play out over a longer period, but is already quite acute. And that economic dimension has as part of it the growing difficulty in providing basic immunization services and other basic services, which could be, if we don't sustain them, the absence of which will be a big cause of loss of life.
Yeah, it seems to be a challenge we're facing now is that so much has pivoted to COVID. Understandably, it's becoming the core issue everyone's focused on, that we may see a backtracking in funding for other issues in development, and especially given your perch in key humanitarian and conflict zones around the world. I understand you're pulling back funding from your own agency in Yemen. Talk to us about the challenge, the push and pull of funding for other humanitarian crises at a moment when we have a global pandemic to contend with.
Well, I think it's important we convey to everybody the fact that our overall funding for all of the appeals that I coordinate, all those issues you just talked about, is up this year compared to where we were this time last year. Last year ended up being a record year, and we are now ahead of that. And that's a positive story, and I hope we can sustain it even as the funding needs grow. What we are running into, though, is various problems of reaching all the people who we need to reach with this assistance. And in one or two places, the funding is below where it was last year. And that's the case in Yemen. In Yemen, I think the donors, understandably, have been extremely frustrated by restrictions put in place on the operation of NGOs and the Red Cross and UN agencies, and have been holding back funding as a result of that. Now, I hope we're turning the corner on that, because we've been closing programs there largely because of shortage of funding, while we continue to battle through these unacceptable restrictions on which we are making progress. Yemen is a little bit unusual. Most other places we've been able to sustain and increase the funding a little bit. But those issues of restrictions of movement could have a serious effect if we don't negotiate continuing access for the humanitarian agencies. So the parallel is, I'm stuck here locked down in my apartment in New York, which I essentially never leave from one fortnight to the next, except for 15 minutes to go and get groceries. But I don't want the health workers in this city to be locked down. I want them and the first responders to be out there doing their work. And the same mindset needs to apply to the humanitarian workers in these countries where we've got humanitarian challenges. So one of the things that we've done through our appeal is put in place a new air service covering now 30 countries in Africa to substitute for the disappearance of commercial airlines in lots of those places. So we can get the vaccines and the essential cargoes and the aid workers in and out. And because the UN is able to negotiate permission with all the national authorities for our planes to land, we've been able to get that new air service up and running in the last week. And that's one of the things we paid for with the first $1 billion that we raised for our appeal since 25 March.
This is the so-called air bridge that I've heard about, we've reported on. And I guess it leads me to another question about the humanitarian workers, because many of them are the people who would be traveling on that air bridge. How are humanitarian agencies like your own addressing the fact that there's a pandemic, that people have to take personal protection? And yet we need to get the aid workers out in the field. You know, we're hearing stories from aid workers about challenges once they're out to be able to get back home. How should we be thinking about the aid worker security component of this?
Well, firstly, we need to sustain the ability to get the aid workers in and out, and particularly in the really tough places, the conflict-affected places, to be able to rotate them in the normal way. That's what one of the key things our air service is trying to do. Secondly, we need to make sure that aid workers don't accidentally be a vector for bringing the virus into new places. And so putting in place safeguards, taking people's temperature, using isolation, quarantine, and so on, that's another important element. The third thing then is protecting people when they are out there in the field. And that has a couple of dimensions. The first is appropriate use of PPE, as you talk about. Of course, that's not a straightforward thing to guarantee because of the global shortages of PPE. The second is some assurances that if you get sick, there's a plan to find a way to look after you. And one of the other things we're doing through our logistics operation is starting to put in place a group of field hospitals, which will be exclusively for the use of humanitarian workers. So that's at a, I hope now, advanced stage of development, and we hope to be up and running with some of those field hospitals shortly.
So as you think about how this plays out, you used to be the permanent secretary at DFID. You take this larger look at the industry broadly, development and humanitarian. You gave this $90 billion figure, which, as you say, in some ways is a big number. You've only been able to raise $1 billion from the initial global humanitarian response plan. Yet it sounds like the way you're describing that plan, it's still a humanitarian plan. In other words, it's dealing with the immediate gaps of people needing food and needing access to medicine. What do you think is required if we think even bigger than that in terms of a development response married to this humanitarian response? What would you like to see the global community stand up and do at a moment of crisis like this?
Well, one of the reasons why I talk about that 90 billion figure and how it can be financed is because if we don't help those countries whose populations' incomes are disappearing, we'll find we have a much bigger humanitarian problem in 6 or 9 or 12 months' time. Yep. And I don't want to have to deal with that. I don't want to see all that suffering. Now, if we put in place what I've talked about, not a business as usual response, an extraordinary response, recognizing we're in an extraordinary situation, to finance greater social protection provision, we can avoid, I believe, that caseload growing to unmanageable levels. But we need to act fast. And I'm talking a lot about this with the World Bank and other people, and with all the donors about it, because I think, one of the things people increasingly understand is if you have that kind of problem in the poorest countries, it doesn't stay in the poorest countries. These problems spread. Yep. So I think increasingly decision makers in the richer countries understand there's a national interest as well as a human empathy and generosity case for helping with that element of the problem.
Yeah, it's hard when you're in a place like New York where you are. It's hard because there's so much crisis right there locally. And so the narrative tends to be here, what's happening right here in my own community. And that's, I think, happening in the major donor countries. It just so happens the UK, the US, and much of Europe are the epicenter of the crisis today. But as you described, it's likely to move 3 to 6 months from now. And yet the conversation has not necessarily developed in that direction, although it sounds like this new plan is starting to move there. What are you hearing from countries? From some of these very vulnerable countries that are now supplying plans to you that have become part of the global plan, what are they asking for?
Well, firstly, it's entirely right that 99% of the effort in the rich countries is dealing with their own issues. I'm strongly in favor of that. But I also think it's part of a smart strategy for 1% of your effort to be on these other places, because if the virus takes hold in some of these other places, it's going to keep circling around and threatens to hit all of us again. And other problems, which, as we've seen over the last decade, can spread, will be fermented if this problem isn't
social disruption, controlled. Things like that.
All of that kind of stuff. Now, what are we hearing, to your other question, from the countries themselves? Well, firstly, they do want help and assistance with the combating of the disease. And that's a big part of what we're doing through the through the plan, in particular the work of the World Health Organization and UNICEF and lots of the NGOs, a lot of health, water and sanitation, those types of activities. Secondly, though, countries who've seen their earnings from commodity exports disappear, who've seen remittances from their nationals who used to send money home to families disappear, who've seen their tourism revenue disappear, they are really struggling to sustain their economies, and they need some help with that as well. So, you know, the things we're talking about, I think, add up to a coherent picture which reflects what countries are saying, as well as what we think can be done on the donor side.
You know, I'm talking to a lot of leaders like yourself who say this is going to be a long-term challenge we're dealing with, right? There might be waves, there might be a peak this year, but this could be 18 months, could be 3 years. The fallout's going to be very significant because of the depth of the economic crisis this pandemic is going to unleash. I guess I'm wondering, given all your experience, what you think the long-term effects are going to be around things like localization. You know, the humanitarian sector is well known for not sending enough money down to the field, to the local organizations who often complain that they don't get a big enough piece of the humanitarian pie. And yet we talk about the importance of resilience at that local level. Issues like cash transfers, you know, and the way that we deliver aid. Maybe perhaps this pandemic will lead to more use of cash transfers and mobile money to get it into the hands of people who need it. What do you think are some of the long-term changes we might see?
Well, firstly, on the disease itself, I think a lot depends on whether there is a second wave in the fall and winter in the richer world, which some people believe, or whether public health measures are put in place to contain that better than was the case with the first wave. A lot depends on the pace at which vaccines and therapeutics are developed. So those are big uncertainties around the disease itself. On the economic consequences, I think it really all depends on what the world does. If the world makes strategic, smart investments earlier to contain the economic damage, then the chance of a faster recovery is higher. If those things aren't done, I think what we'll end up with is a much more expensive, much longer lasting problem. I do think all the things you talked about innovation in the sector will happen. More cash, more localization, lots of other reforms. They will happen, and that will make the sector better.
So just before we close, because I know you have to run in this very busy moment for you, your job is always busy, but maybe particularly so at the moment. I wonder if you could shed some light on the fundraising side of this, right? You're updating this appeal, kind of the headline is likely to be the large increase now that we're 6 weeks past the first version, the $6.7 billion figure. You're talking to donors all the time. It's a tricky conversation to have because the crisis right now is so centered in places like New York. What are you hearing from donors? Is there appetite for this $6.7 billion plan? Is there appetite for the $90 billion idea that you're throwing out there as well?
Well, that's the conversation we're going to get into now. I mean, we're just right now issuing the updated plan. I have been talking about this $90 billion concept for a week or so now. I think people are all listening and thinking. What I would observe is, firstly, that after the 2008 crisis, by 2010, there was a 40% increase in funding for the UN coordinated humanitarian responses. There was also a huge recapitalization of the international financial institutions to give them much stronger balance sheets and much more financial firepower for these kinds of problems. So, you know, I think we have seen an example of the world coming together to deal with big problems in a way which was at least partially effective. At the moment, what we see is lots of collaboration among NGOs, international organizations, the private sector, especially the pharmaceutical sector, some collaboration among governments. There was a very good event to raise $8 billion a couple of days ago for vaccine and therapeutic developments. but not all of the biggest players and countries are engaging in the way that I think would be ideal in that global cooperation. And that's something we would like to see more of in the period ahead. Individually, many countries are, doing, taking lots of generous decisions and recognize they need to play their part. But I think there's scope for a stronger collective effort in everybody's individual interest.
Back in 2017 at Devex, we put out a report. We interviewed 40 of the world's leading global health experts to ask what are the big things they're worried about. Tony Fauci was one of the people who participated in that report. And the number one issue that came out above all others was a pandemic, a flu-like pandemic that would take over the world. This is something we've kind of known could hit. And yet you're so right. It's unfortunately, we haven't been really prepared for it, but maybe this is the moment, the kind of opportunity in a crisis to get the world to stand up and do something together. So we at Devex at least are trying to get that narrative out there that the pandemic is truly a global event, not just a US or European one. And thank you for taking some time to talk with us about the new updated report. We're going to get that out with this video to our audience. And we look forward to driving the conversation forward on what we think is one of the most important issues in the world. That's how the most vulnerable will respond in the face of this.
Raj, thank you.